So this was the paper that said, look, we think of corruption as about stealing money. But another thing that actually is a really big problem is that people, in some sense, steal time. And what that could mean is the idea that if you're paid to work, but you don't show up at work, you still collect your wages. That's sort of another form of stealing government resources, right? And that could be a particularly costly form if basically people who want to go to school and there's no teacher there, or people who want to go to a health clinic and there's no nurse or doctor there, right? They can't get treated. That could be particularly costly. And so what they did to measure this is they went to primary schools and health clinics in 6 countries: Bangladesh, Ecuador, India, Indonesia, Peru, and Uganda. And they randomly showed up, unannounced, at times when the clinic or the school was supposed to be open. And they just counted and sort of saw who was there and looked at what fraction of the total people who were supposed to be there working were actually there. And they get these, again, I think, fairly shocking numbers. 19% of teachers were absent, right? So just to give you a sense of your own magnitudes, if you think back to your own high school or elementary school experience, this would imply having your teacher absent once a week on average, right? Which seems much higher than probably the absent rate actually was. You're saying maybe not in your school? Seems quite high, I think. And 35% of health workers weren't absent, or were absent, sorry. So these are pretty substantial rates. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is, before I sort of said, look, our cross-country measures of corruption were all about perceptions-based. But here's actually a case where we can measure the exact same thing, right? What fraction of people who are supposed to be there are there, in an objective way. And we can, again, plot it against per capita income. The dots are Indian states, and the triangles are countries. And again, you can see a strong downward sloping relationship. Here it's downward sloping, basically meaning the richer you are, the lower the absence rate is, by a factor of like a half. But the poorest areas are sort of like double kind of the absence rates of the richer areas. Okay, so this is first of all, it's an amazing fact that there's this much absence, but it's also I think a validation of this idea that these problems are worse in poorer countries. Questions?
Yeah, how do we know that this isn't just an implicit part of their contract? So it's in America we have absent days or whatever, but what if it just implied if you want to become a teacher, you're gonna get paid $2 an hour cheaper, but you know that you can do this once a week?
Right. So that's a great question. What I think is interesting is that so that's a great question. So we don't fully know what would happen. So your question, another way of thinking about it is, what would happen if we started to enforce these contracts rigidly, right? So there's two things that one thing we do know, one thing we don't know. The thing we do know is if we start to enforce these contracts more rigidly, we get better outcomes, right? So if we can actually make the teachers show up, we get better learning outcomes. Test scores for kids go up. So that's telling you that this absence is potentially costly, okay? The second part of your question is the harder part, which is to say, if you enforce these rigidly and you didn't raise the wage, would you get worse quality teachers?
Or do the wages, I guess another.
Or would the wages have to go up? The same question, would the wages have to go up in order to compensate them? And that I don't think we have a good answer to. But you're right, it's an important question. And maybe this is a cheap way of getting really good doctors. It's a good question. I don't think we have an answer to that. Yeah.
How many times did they randomly come? Because wouldn't after a while, wouldn't that the actual surveying include?
Yeah, I don't remember if they did the same facility multiple times. I don't remember the answer to that question. Other questions? Okay. So, what I want to show you from magnitude is, first of all, a couple of different ways of measuring corruption, and then substantial heterogeneity in these magnitudes. Right? One thing also to note, by the way, is that I think we tend to think corruption is a very serious problem. I've spent a lot of time studying corruption. I wouldn't have done that if I didn't think it was a serious problem. But we may actually think it may actually be a worse problem, not as bad a problem as we think it is, because we tend to measure corruption in places where we had some ex-ante sense it was a problem, right? So, I have my own stories of this, of places, I wanted to do a study of what changes corruption in this way or the other way, and you try to do that in a place where there's no corruption, it's not going to be a very interesting study, right? And if you want to shed light on the economic theory of corruption, you need to go to a place where there's some corruption to sort of look at it. And if all of our measures of kind of where there's corruption are places where we sort of thought it was likely to be a problem, then you might be overestimating corruption a little bit. So just another thing to keep in mind. I don't think it's a huge problem, but something to keep in mind.